All right, those were some of the key highlights from Donald Trump's inaugural address. For more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Christina Anna Dragomir, political analyst and commentator from New York. Thank you so much for joining us on WION World is One. I want to begin by asking you, what were some of the key highlights from the inaugural address for you?
Thank you very much, Him, for having me over. I think it's really important to see that it's nothing new that we have seen today. It's just a very bold vision that now President Trump is expressing for America and for his governance coming. Important points that we really need to address are immigration and border control, and also the position that the United States has in the world. I think those two are actually related and makes the speech quite interesting. The Democrats are qualifying it as a contradictory speech. But I would like to challenge that by saying that this is actually a speech that will put America into a new era, as he says, and presents a new vision of America. One that it is both isolationist, one that is actually looking inwards, is looking at America first, but also positions America as a global leader, as going further than ever before, as expanding even outside of our world. He is proposing an expansion into Mars. So expanding territory, it's something that goes hand in hand with American isolationism and America securing its borders and looking inwards and placing itself first. So those aspects that seem contradictory, actually we need to think about them as Donald Trump, now the president of the United States, will put forward as a new vision for America.
Right, Dr. Dragomir. In fact, I was just going to come to that. Trump has emphasized that he will put America first. Do you see this affirmation, from what I'm gauging, you don't, see this affirmation as necessarily negative with regards to Trump's foreign policies, perhaps?
So it seems to come as a surprise, and the surprise is actually in terms of the rhetoric that he's using. He's using a concept that, for those of us who have been studying American politics for a number of years, it's puzzling, and that is a theory that started in 1895 called the Manifest Destiny, which portrays United States as a nation that is destined by God, which is destined by divinity to take over land. Of course, they are referring to expanding the territory of the United States into the western part of the United States, which is now California and so on. But Trump is using it to position United States as a nation of the 21st century that is destined to lead, to conquer, to innovate, to push the frontiers, to explore and to grow. And therefore, he uses this rhetoric to galvanize a national pride and to justify his territorial ambitions. He did not mention right now Greenland, and he also did not mention Canada as a possible 51st state of United States. But these are ideas that he vehiculated just a little bit earlier. So people are still remembering this. So what we see right now is this idea that America is still an exceptional country, one that is destined by some form of divinity to expand its territory and to lead the world into a new century. So he's using a very old idea in order to propose an aggressive form of leadership for the 21st century.
Right. Now, just for better understanding here, this expansionist rhetoric that we're talking about, it is likely to unsettle global leaders. And wouldn't you assess then that would put some sort of strain on international relations?
Of course, this kind of rhetoric is unheard of in the past years. A leader of a country, especially of a country that is signatory to so many treaties, such an important member of alliances such as the NATO alliance, to be making those claims, those territorial claims, onto the Panama Canal, on other type of territories, is bound to unsettle some of the relationships that United States has been having for some time. Nevertheless, Donald Trump, I think he wants to unsettle those traditional relationships. He wants to come forward as a new type of leader, one that will restore United States as the hegemon, as the global leader of the world. And at the same time as he's doing this, he's trying to do two things. He is trying to propose himself as a peacemaker, but as he's doing this, he is telling us that he is going to the military. Yes. Can you hear me?
Right. Yes, I can. Please continue.
Yes. So both as a peacemaker, but also as a military leader. So as we see right now, he is forging a new vision of United States, a new vision and a new, what he calls the golden era. We will see how much gold this era will bring, but definitely we are entering a new era of foreign policy, one that will unsettle many of the relationships that United States has been having for the past decades.
Right, Dr. Dragomir, I have to say that's rather a unique perspective on that. And also, do stay on with us. We're now being joined by our correspondent, Susan Tehrani, who's also joining us from New York. Susan, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Dragomir and I, we were just talking about how Trump's assertions in his inaugural address and what it essentially means for international relations under Trump 2.0. What's your take on that, Susan?
Yeah, Donald Trump really during his inaugural address repeated what he's been saying on the campaign trail. He wants peace through strength. He is weary of the wars around the world. He believes that Joe Biden could have prevented them. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East region. Those are the two main ones. And then, of course, relations between countries as well. He talks about peace through strength. He prefers to deal with leaders one-on-one as opposed to a multilateral setting. And we've seen that work for him during the first administration. Now let's wait and see how he's going to maneuver that during the second administration, is he's going to make any changes or not. Of course, he's willing to work with NATO as long as NATO countries pay their fair share. We know Jens Stoltenberg was praising Donald Trump. He was looking forward to Donald Trump coming into office, although he's the outgoing Secretary General of NATO. Mark Rutte has praised him as well. But the way that world leaders have sort of turned to Donald Trump from the time he campaigned to the time he won and the time that he was in Mar-a-Lago waiting to become president, I think it's an indication that he is going to have a good relationship with most leaders around the world. And that sort of sense of isolationism that a lot of people were sort of harping on, it might not be as much of an isolationist foreign policy as perhaps some of his supporters had hoped during the campaign.
Right. Dr. Dragomir, coming back to you, I'm sure you've heard Susan. She says peace through strength. And I want to ask you, you were talking about how Donald Trump is also positioning himself as a peacemaker while also positioning himself as a military leader. Do you think it's one and the same thing?
Absolutely, it's not one of the same thing, but Donald Trump is trying to blend both of them. And I think this is the point that we really need to pay attention to, that it is a new way of thinking about politics. He is not bringing anything new to the table. Peace through strength was the idea that was used during the Cold War by former President Reagan, for example, who was considering that being a strong global leader, United States will be able to actually bring peace to the world. This is something that after that President Bush took onwards and orchestrated all the military interventions under the same idea that once United States is projecting itself as the powerful military hegemon, is actually going to bring peace to the world as democracies do not fight each other. This was one of the ideas that was quite popular at the time in the 2000s. But right now, with Donald Trump, we see a re-emergence of this idea, but through different means. Donald Trump is not using the same approaches as the neocons or President Bush or President Reagan, but he is using his position as what he calls as one of the a business negotiator to negotiate new deals globally and position United States once again, he says, in a really powerful position worldwide.
Right, Dr. Dragomir. Also, you mentioned that he did not mention Greenland in his inaugural address, and that's correct. But he did mention Panama Canal, and he did say that China is operating in Panama Canal and we will take it back. There was, of course, a reaction from the Panamanian president as well, saying that Panama Canal is Panamanian and will continue to remain Panamanian. And also, there was this comment earlier by the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying that Trump is to rename Gulf of Mexico as Gulf of America as part of Day 1 executive orders. So what will be the practical implications of that?
I think this is all a part of the grandiose vision that he has. And while those might be somehow symbolical gestures, like the renaming of a canal, of the Gulf, the Panama Canal is a very important transportation means for United States. And we really need to think about this in a more complex way. When he talks about the Panama Canal, he's actually referring to the at least triangular, if not more, trade dynamics that are going on within the region, with China playing a really important role. And he actually mentioned this today very clearly when he mentioned the Panama Canal, saying that this has to do with China. But what he did not mention, but one that studies history will find out very easily, that what he's looking at is the history of the Panama Canal, but the recent history and the importance that China plays into the trade dynamics that are taking place within the region that is obviously influencing United States as well. So while it seems to be a bombastic gesture, it is actually related very much to the economic ties that United States has with its partners down south, but also with its partners in the east, like China. So this will be influencing a great deal of factors and of actors worldwide. So this, I think, is a quite well planned, very well thought action that he seems to be very focused on and willing to take action on. That's another aspect of Donald Trump that I think was very obvious throughout the work that throughout the speech that we have seen today, and that is that he really would like to portray himself as a man of action, man that is ready to go, man that is ready to change not only the face of presidency of United States and of America in general, but of the global dynamics as well.
All right, Doctor, just for better understanding here, and I'm seeking more clarity on the point that you made. So when he says that Panama Canal, we will take it back, what does that essentially entail? Because you're saying that perhaps he is referring to trade and China's role there. So what does taking back Panama Canal entail then?
United States has been supporting the development of Panama Canal financially. So therefore, Donald Trump is insinuating that United States has certain claims over the canal itself. And also he has been complaining in the past about the bad deals that United States has in terms of trade that is taking place on the canal. Therefore, what it seems to be that he is aiming at is to look at the Panama Canal as one of the ways in which he will address the trade deficit that United States has been incurring with China, in spite of the efforts that he made in his first presidency, in spite of the efforts that actually former President Biden continued to make in relationship with China during his presidency. But right now, Donald Trump is willing to take a more aggressive format and not only look at the trade deficit and the trade deals that are directly between United States and China, but it seems that he is ready to look at other possibilities and look at how other countries are participating into creating those trade dynamics between the United States and China as well. So I think this is one of the important points that we will see with Trump 2.0, as it is currently called, that he is willing to take not only the classical approach of negotiating treaties, which is his purview as the President of the United States, but also a larger approach which includes other countries, other regions in the world, in order to affect the trade deficit that the United States is currently facing.
All right, Dr. Dragomir, I'm going to bring Susan back into this conversation. Susan, you have been covering this from New York. What has been the reaction to these comments that Trump has made in the lead up to his inaugural address, and also now in his inaugural address, what he said about the Panama Canal and the comments that we're hearing about the Gulf of Mexico to be renamed? What has been the response to that?
Some people believe that these are symbolic gestures, but others believe that, while the Panama Canal issue may sort of be a negotiating tactic, like the other things that he mentioned, like tariffs on China and whatnot, and on Mexico as well, and Canada, but ultimately the Greenland issue might be a lot more serious because it's in the periphery of the United States. And again, there is just vast concern about the security nature of, how it's being conducted in regards to the United States. But I do want to say he also mentioned that he wants to rename Mount Denali in Alaska to Mount McKinley. And something that I haven't really heard anyone say is that it used to be Mount McKinley, and it was Barack Obama in 2015 who changed it to Mount Denali ultimately. So, it's not very uncommon for presidents to do this, but because it's Donald Trump, I think it's gaining a lot more traction and a lot more coverage. Again, just because they seem so outrageous, but ultimately, we'll have to wait and see if it's a negotiating tool or if he really wants to go to the Panama Canal and Greenland, which at one point he said that he wasn't ruling out using military force. Again, all of this seems very unlikely, but then, we'll have to wait and see if that's the direction that the new Trump administration wants to take. But here in New York, of course, we are living in a liberal state. This is a very blue state, although a lot of Republicans did vote red and voted for Donald Trump, even our youth. Ultimately, the politicians in New York are going to be pushing back on a lot of Trump policies, and perhaps the Panama Canal issue will be one of it. But I'm thinking, anticipating that the migrant issue is also going to be another thing. The issue of energy independence is going to be another thing. So these are going to be things that politicians here in New York, in terms of reaction, are going to be grappling with and are going to be reacting when it comes to what Donald Trump said.
All right, Susan, thank you so much for mentioning that. Dr. Dragomir, in fact, I want to take your insights on that. When it comes to the immigration issue, when it comes to the national energy emergency, as he called it, what's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's an important point, and thank you, Susan, for bringing this up, because the immigration issues will be played by President Trump through the executive orders, but it's actually in the purview of Congress. He does have a majority in Congress, even though it's slim. So this is maybe the time for Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. What it worries me about the rhetoric that we heard tonight is that immigration is always discussed in relationship to borders and to national security. As you have heard, Donald Trump is ready to formulate a new type of identity of certain migrants as terrorists, and certain migrant organizations as terrorist groups, and he's referring to of course to criminals. And that's a really important point, of course, that the immigrants were also criminals. But nevertheless, by equating immigration and border security, by talking in the same phrase about immigrants and criminality, what we create create is this idea that immigrants are posing a threat to the nation. And while, of course, there are certain people that will always bring certain difficulties to the countries in which they decide to reside, that it's happening both with the people who are born there and people who are coming there. It is quite dangerous to equate immigration with security and to make immigrants into possible threat to the national security. This will create not only a legal framework that President Trump is actually ready to enforce starting today with the executive orders that we are all looking forward to see and to see the details of it, but also it will create a certain rhetoric that will reverberate throughout the country about immigrants, about criminality, about them threatening security. And that would put into the shadow so many immigrants that are coming into the country legally, that are not criminals, that are following the path, and they are there as refugees, as asylum seekers. It's going to be really hard for them to combat this kind of understanding that criminality is always related to border security, and they are seen as a threat to the nation and to the so-called golden age that he proposed.
Right, Dr. Dragomir, you raise a very important point there. And in fact, for better understanding of our viewers, could you also talk about the 1798 Alien Enemies Act to be invoked, which he mentioned in his inaugural address as well?
Can we just pause a second and acknowledge that we are talking about an act that is 1798 and we are in 2025? This actually says a lot about the lack of legislation that currently United States Congress has with respect to immigration. We are living in the 21st century, operating with the law of the 18th century. This is an abominable situation in which United States is finding itself. We do need comprehensive legislation with respect to immigration to be created and enforced in the United States that represents the interests of the United States within the 2025, in the 21st century. This being said, this Alien Enemy Act will allow the people who are in charge to act and address immigrants as criminals, as possible enemies to the country. This will lead to an enforcement of the policies that are going to deport many of the migrants. There will be detentions of migrants and so on. That being said, this act will have to be looked at by people who are looking at the legislation about immigration in the country. ICE, which is the immigration enforcement body of United States, will be able to have data about migrants, to go to even arrest them and deport them. But their hands are not as free as President Trump makes it look like right now.